Hello, and thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Ian Scott, and I am the managing partner of Scott Legal. And today we are here to talk a little bit about the E-2 visa requirements and some renewal considerations. The E-2 visa is a visa that is certainly very near and dear to my heart as I'm in the United States on an E-2 visa. I obtained the E-2 visa for Scott Legal PC approximately 12 years ago and have renewed twice in Toronto. So as recently as a year and a half, I was in the US consulate in Toronto renewing the E-2 visa. And we certainly are an E-2 success story with over 14 full-time employees and success over the last several years. Just a few housekeeping things before we start the webinar. We will send you a number of things after the webinar. First, we will send you a copy of the PowerPoint presentation that we're going to go through. This webinar is also being recorded, so we will send you a link where you will be able to see the recording on YouTube. We do encourage you to subscribe to our YouTube channel. We have a number of E-2 and other videos that we regularly post on that channel, so you can receive a notification every time we post a video that may be helpful to you. Also, if you have any questions during the presentation, please feel free to add them to the Q&A box or the chat box, and we will certainly be able to answer those questions as soon as we get to a logical break to be able to answer the questions. So, and without further ado, we can jump right into the presentation. Okay, so, at the heart of it, what the E-2 visa is, it's a visa that allows you to come to the United States to either buy a business or start a business. So that is the crux of it. And then the other kind of big thing with the E-2 visa is that the E-2 visa is country specific. So if you are coming to the United States and you want to obtain an E-2 visa, you do have to be a national of a treaty country. And there are many treaty countries in almost every continent except Antarctica. For example, in Europe, there's France, there's Germany, there's the United Kingdom. There are, many countries within Europe. There are also some countries in Africa, Asia. Japan is probably the largest E-2 treaty country in terms of the number of visas that are issued. But a number of other countries in Japan, including South Korea and many more. In South America, we have a number of countries. We have Colombia, we have Argentina, we have Chile. And there are also countries in the Middle East that are eligible. So around 80 or so countries around the world, but you do have to be a national from one of those countries. And what that means is that you have a passport from the country. There are some immigration benefits that are regulated by where you are born, but this particular visa is not. It is regulated by having a passport from that particular country. So you could be born in, for example, China or India, neither of which, the two most populous countries in the world, neither of which are E-2 visa countries. But if you lived in the UK and obtained residency there and obtained a passport, or lived in Canada and obtained residency there and obtained a passport, then you would be able to still apply for an E-2 visa. Kind of the other big question that comes up with E-2 visas is, how long can they be issued for? And the E-2 visa can be issued for anywhere between 3 months and 5 years. So there are a few things that kind of regulate how long the E-2 visa is going to be issued for. And the primary thing is which country you're from. So there are a number of countries where the E-2 visa is going to be issued for 5 years. So Canada, Germany, a number of the UK, a number of countries where the E-2 visa is issued for 5 years. But then there are some countries like Egypt and Bangladesh where the E-2 visa can only be issued for 3 months. And in some cases, those would just be single entry visas. So the one thing to kind of think about with this, though, is that the visa is an entry document only. So even if your visa is issued for 3 months, what that means is that you have 3 months to come to the United States, and every time that you come to the United States or enter on an E-2 visa, whether the visa has been issued for 3 months or three years or 5 years or however long it's been issued for, you have 2 years in E-2 status. So your stay in the United States is regulated by something called an I-94. So if you enter even with a 3-month visa, you will be given 2 years in E-2 status, which means you're allowed to live and work in the United States for that 2-year period. However, if you had a 3-month visa and then let's say you entered the United States and then a year after that you want to leave and re-enter, then you would have to go back to the consulate and get a new visa. Similarly, if you had a 5-year visa and you entered the United States, you would only have an I-94 for 2 years, and you would have to leave and re-enter. So you could leave and re-enter even the same day, but you do have to reset that I-94 every couple of years, every 2 years and it will reset. But in that case, in the case where you have the visa for that period of time, for a longer period of time, if you did leave the United States and then you decided that you wanted to come back, then or when you came back rather, you would be able to utilize the visa to re-enter and your I-94 would reset at that time. In terms of the purchasing and starting a business, we do a lot of both. We do, an individual may say, for example, want to come and buy a restaurant from someone. They may buy the shares or the assets of a restaurant or another existing business, and that can qualify for an E-2. But I'd say that the overwhelming number of E-2 visas that we do are starting a business, and they can be for many different things. They can be someone that's starting a restaurant as well, but starting it from scratch. It can be a service-oriented business, a consulting business. As you all know, the law firm was founded on an E-2 visa with legal services or exactly that, a service. When you think of businesses, any businesses, whether it's a pool cleaning business, whether it's a convenience store, whether it's a gas station, think of any business, and we've probably done an E-2 visa for it. So any legal, legitimate business, we've probably done an E-2 visa for it. So, and as I said, the overwhelming number of people usually have a business that is, they're starting a business rather than purchasing a business. So let's go again to the crux of the E-2 visa requirements, because the last thing I talked about was more or less an overview. So we talked about already that you must be a national of a treaty country. So we talked about a number of those treaties, and there is a list, right? So you can go to, you can Google E-2 treaty countries and have the list at your fingertips. But do keep in mind that the list changes. So make sure that you have the most up-to-date and accurate list. So for example, New Zealand was recently added to the E-2 visa list. Israel was recently added to the E-2 visa list. Portugal was added. They still have some things to work out before nationals of that country can actually get E-2 visas, but that's going to be pending. But similarly, some countries drop off. Like Bolivia has dropped off. Ecuador has dropped off the list. So it is important to make sure that you're looking at the list, but sometimes when you're looking at the list, a country might be on the list and then there's a little asterisk, and then you go down to look at what that means, and it ends up that that particular country is the E-2 visas, new people cannot apply. So it's just that they're still on the list based on legacy. It's something to keep in mind. So the other big thing with E-2 visas, E-2 visa is an investor visa, so you are required to make an investment in the US. And the funds must actually be at risk. And what that means is, this is a very, very difficult thing for people to get their heads around, that you actually do have to invest the money before you get the visa. So that's very scary to some people, but unfortunately, that's the way that it goes. You can't just have money sitting in a bank account and saying, well, I have the intent to invest the visa. We had an applicant who was opening a gym, and she went to her interview, and the officer asked her, so if I went to the gym, what would I see now? And she said, well, I have equipment, I have lease, I have employees in place, I have my bank account set up, I have my website set up, and all they're really waiting for is for me to get the visa so that we can open the doors. And that's kind of the answer that they're looking for. And that was before she got the visa, right? So, but that is a requirement. So at risk typically means that you've actually spent the money. Right? So even if you have a lease agreement, you're only able to include the investment related to what you've actually spent. So if you've given a deposit and you've paid first and last month's rent, then you can include that in the investment amount, but you wouldn't be able to include the amounts in investment related to the commitment associated with that lease. So The other big thing with E-2 visas is that there is a requirement in statute that talks about source of funds, and really this requirement is saying that you have to show that the money came from a legitimate source. So now this requirement, when we're dealing with consulates for the most part, it's not one that we spend a significant amount of time on. Consulates aren't so fixated on this. When we do the USCIS filings, it becomes much more of an issue or much more of a focus on the applications, but consulates don't tend to focus much on this. We tend to say to clients that they should, provide information related to where they obtained the money from. So if they obtained the money from working, maybe just have a few years of tax return showing that they could have saved that money if they acquired the money from selling a property, information related to that particular sale. But really, we don't, most consulates tend to have page limits. So we tend to include very few pages on sources of funds because it's just not something that they focus on. In terms of the investment itself, it can be from a gift or a loan, so you can have money gifted to you. And also, in terms of the investment, the money doesn't have to come from the treaty country. So if someone, let's say, had a brother or sister in the United States, and the brother or sister decided that they wanted to gift the investor the money, and the money came from the United States, that's completely fine. There's no prohibition on that at all. So the other big thing, and we're going to talk about it in the next slide, so I'm just going to touch on it here, is that the investment must be substantial. So, and as I said, we're going to talk about it in the next slide, so we'll talk about it once we actually go there. And then here's some example on the slide of some typical expenditures. And these are all good expenditures: inventory, equipment, rent, marketing. And as I say that, because there are bad expenditures, like we would want to include things on your travel. Sometimes cars or vehicles can be bad expenditures if they're not really related to the business. Sometimes training costs can be bad expenditures. Food can be a bad expenditure. So not all expenditures are created equally, and you are literally presenting them with a list of everything that you've spent money on and the invoices and the proof of payment. The one other thing to kind of keep in mind, and maybe this goes back to the first point of being a national of the treaty country, what happens with an E-2 is that you are setting up an entity in the United States, right? So there's an entity that's in the United States, and that entity is visa. It's an entity that you are going to own at least 50% of the entity, right? So that's what you're going to, you're going. So now when we look at E-2 visas, we're always looking at the entity within the United States, and we're making sure that the entity is at least 50% owned by nationals from treaty countries. It can be owned 100%, that's not a problem, but we're going to say at least 50% owned by nationals of the treaty country. So the other big thing, and I'm going to come back and talk about escrow agreements in a little bit, but the other big thing that is related to E-2 visas has to do with employees. So one big thing is investment, the other big thing is employees. Now, the E-2 visas, that's really what it's all about. The reason the government likes this program and has implemented this program is because they want companies, E-2 companies, to be able to hire U.S. workers. And the way that this particular requirement is outlined in the regulations is that the business cannot be marginal. And that's the way they outline this or describe it, is that the business cannot be set up to support just the investor and or his or her family. Now, what that means, though, is that the business has to be one that can support employees, right? So that's what it's getting at when they have that requirement. And like I said, it's very, very important, and it's the kind of the big thing with respect to E-2 visas, and the whole reason that they are there. And what we typically like to see is within a 5-year period, at least the equivalent of 3 full-time employees being hired. And sometimes if it's a startup business, we're going to have a business plan that's going to show that. There's no requirement to have employees on day one. It certainly can be helpful for an application, or if you have a contract showing that you have employees, or even prospects. So if you have letters of intent that show that you're going to have, you already have some clients or people who want to hire you, those are all going to be things that show the US government that you are capable of hiring employees. So it can be business plan, it can be letters of intent, it can be contracts that you already have, or it can be a contract for employment to hire somebody once you have the E-2 visa. Those are all going to be very helpful for your application, and they're all things that we would highlight as positive things in your application. The business must be real and operating. This ties in a little bit to the investment in the at-risk amount, and the example that I gave with respect to the gym, and really everything being ready so that whether it's licenses, whether it's websites, whether it's contracts with customers, all of those things are ready before you actually even submit the E-2 visa application. And the E-2 visa is not a passive form of investment. So you can't get an E-2 visa. Unlike the EB-5, you can't get an E-2 visa with the thought that, well, I just want to come to the United States and invest and be a silent partner and I'll own 50% of the company or 100% of the company, but I don't want to do anything really. That's not an E-2 visa. The E-2 visa does have a requirement that you develop and direct the operations. That typically translates owning 50%, but it also translates actually doing something in the company. And so E-2 visa is not for the passive investment. And that's sometimes why we have difficulty with, and someone had sent a question earlier about real estate investments, which we'll get to when we do the Q&A. But that's why sometimes some businesses like real estate investing or equity firms sometimes can be difficult for E-2s because an examiner may see them as fairly passive. So definitely there is a requirement that the business owner, the investor, is a part of the business. And then the last requirement is that you have the intent to return to your home country upon expiration of the E-2 visa. Now, this is a requirement that's really based on the fact that most non-immigrant visas have a requirement that you maintain ties to home country. Although the E-2 visa is a non-immigrant visa that is a single intent visa, the fact is that it's a very relaxed requirement because the regulations explicitly say that the individual does not have to maintain their home country, maintain a home in their home country. So generally, this requirement can be satisfied just with a note, a letter that says that the person plans to return to their home country on expiration of the E-2 visa. But the E-2 visa really is a visa that you can keep and live and work in the US. An E-2 investor visa, anyway, is a visa that you really could live and keep and work in the US indefinitely. So I've been on E-2 for the last 12 years. I have 2 US citizen kids, and it really is a visa that you can spend the rest of your life in the U.S. on, and yeah, so that is something to consider. Now, I said on the last slide, I said that we talk more about how much investment is enough, and this is probably the single biggest or most frequent question that we get asked for E-2 visas: how much do I have to spend? So of course, most people want to spend as little as possible. Why not, right? So if you have business acumen and you figure, well, why should I spend money on things that I don't really need? The whole idea with starting a new business should be that, from a business perspective, is that I spend very little, keep expenditures as low as possible. Well, unfortunately, that sometimes is not going to work for an E-2 visa, because there is something in the requirements that says that you must spend a substantial amount. Now, the requirements don't give an amount, unlike some other visas like EB-5, where they say, okay, you have to spend $800,000 or give amounts. This particular visa doesn't give an amount. And so it depends on a number of different things. So one of the things that it depends on is the type of business that you are running. So when I say type of business, how much does it cost to get that particular business up and running? So for a consulting or service-oriented business, that's obviously going to be less than if you are starting a convenience store or maybe a gas station or a restaurant. It's going to be less because we all know, or probably know, that you could get a service-oriented business set up with a very low amount of money, maybe even $5,000 or $10,000. However, unfortunately, even for those businesses that have very, very low setup costs, although the regulations talk about the type of business and that, you look at the proportionality test to say how much would it require to get this particular business up and running, the government's just not going to accept low investment amounts. Generally speaking, they're not going to accept $10,000 or $5,000 as an investment amount. So it does unfortunately put you in the position where when you do have these businesses like service-oriented businesses, that you're in a position where you do have to spend more money, maybe on things that you didn't want to or don't need. I was in the exact same position myself. When I obtained my E-2, I got a lease for $1,700 a month for office space, and I was locked in for a year. So, it was 20 grand or more than that. I didn't need it. I didn't have any clients. I was new. I got space at home. I didn't need it at all. However, I do think it went a long way to assisting with my E-2 visa, because I was able to include the last month's rent, and I think I maybe prepaid a few months of rent and was able to include that in my investment amount to increase the investment amount. So definitely, we'd recommend that one spends at least $50,000 in spend, so not working capital. The government pretty much ignores working capital. So when we talk about investment amount, we will include the working capital in the investment amount, but government tends to ignore it, and we're talking about money spent. If you're buying a business, obviously there aren't going to be very many businesses that you can buy for $50,000 or maybe even over $100,000, not businesses that are profitable anyway. So usually the investment amount that is associated with the purchase price might be sufficient. And in that case, you're going to be looking more at how many employees does the business that you're buying have, right? And now the thing is, if you're spending under $300,000, if your business costs under $300,000 to get set up, then you really should be spending 100% of the money before you apply for the E-2 visa. And sometimes what you can do, and we don't recommend this in every case, you have to work closely with your immigration lawyer to assess when we want to use a CPA letter. We can bolster a case by including a CPA letter that says that based on a review of the business plan, that we believe that the person spent everything that's required to get this particular business up and running. Right, so that's something that can be helpful, but unfortunately, it can only be helpful in some consulates. It's not helpful at every consulate. Sometimes consulates that have been around for a while and process a high volume of E-2s, they're not very guided by a CPA letter. So I find it works a little better in consulates that don't do a lot of E-2 visas. So because the consulates that do a lot of E-2 visas, they're going to have in their mind just how much should be spent, and there's not going to be much you can do to change their opinion with respect to that. So we always push people to spend more. It's always going to be beneficial for the case. We understand the reason people don't want to spend more, but as I said, it's a trade-off between what making your case risky or not. When you are doing a business purchase, the fair market value usually will just be what the purchase price is, and that sometimes that becomes an issue if you're buying from friends or family. So that's something that the government is very aware of. So you have to tread carefully depending on what the particular facts are. Consulates love franchises. So this brings me to a good point with respect to, clients often want a number. Say, well, how much do I have to spend? And they're so focused on that number. But we try to steer them away from that, because in addition to the general test with respect to the type of business that exists, we also have to keep in mind that a case that may have other strong factors. So a case, for example, that might already have employees, or we did a case once where the person invested very low, maybe 25,000 or something. But it was a doctor's office, and she already had these insurance contracts that showed that it was going to be very, very lucrative. And also with the doctor's office, the examiners are very used to the idea in their mind. They're just, okay, well, whenever you go into a doctor's office, there are always people there. There's a receptionist, there are other people there, lab technicians, there are people there. And so they can kind of see that there are employees. There could be employees already there. There could be a business that lends itself to employees. It could be that the person has many letters of intent or contracts or prospects. And those all make a case better, because the investment only is a proxy to see how much investment can generate future employment. And so if the case is a lot better or has all of these positive factors, that might be that a lower investment amount is doable, right? So it's, and as I said, there's no investment amount that's too low to apply. We can apply with very low investment amounts. However, it just increases the risk that the case might be denied at a consulate. And it's always best to put your best foot forward. And we talked a little bit about kind of good and bad E-2 visa expenditures already. So the next question is employees. So, do we have to hire employees? Absolutely. So you don't have to have employees on day one. However, you do have to show the government that your business is capable of hiring employees in the future. And the the number we throw out there is 3 to 4 equivalent of full-time employees. You could have a bunch of part-time employees within the next 5 years, and your business plan would show this. And if you're buying a business, you want to show that that already exists, or show that you have the ability to do things to make the business expand in terms of the number of employees. And we always get the question as well, do they have to be W-2? They don't have to be, but they're better. The government likes W-2, and they also like US citizens and green card holders more than, let's say, people on visas. But we'll take anyone. We'll include anyone who's a visa holder or a green card holder or US citizen. But just again, there are degrees of what's better. And we'll also take 1099 workers if they're 1099 workers that are actual workers. So we don't want to include like your accountant, if you paid your accountant once during the year, 1099, or someone who came to paint your office once and you paid them as a 1099. Those ones aren't really going to be helpful. But if you have people who are doing regular work for you, or if the business lends itself to paying with 1099s, if we had some photographers that we did E-2s for, and they would use other photographers as subcontractors, and they were paid as 1099, and that's just how it works. Same thing with home renovation. The people that are hired, the electricians, plumbers, et cetera, are often paid as 1099 for a home renovation business. So that's going to be the norm. So in those cases, we may not see any W-2 employees, but you can still argue that there's an economic benefit and that these 1099 people are actually, actually workers. And then, in terms of how do you prove it, as I said, on day one, you don't really require a business plan. So on day one, you don't really require to have employees, but you would have a business plan, right? So the business plan would be a 5-year business plan, comprehensive balance sheet, income statement, cash flow statement, usually 20 some odd pages, maybe a little more, and really good executive summary explaining everything. And if it's an existing business, we're going to, go to the payroll information. So that's
Perfect, Ian. Thank you so much. My name is Michaela Romesser, and I'll be taking over the second part of the presentation. So let's talk a little bit about the business plan, like when do you need to submit a business plan and what should the business plan contain? So as Ian mentioned, if you are starting a new company in the US, you will definitely need to submit a business plan. Just so you are able to explain, like what will your company be doing, your hiring projections, and, like how do you plan to market your company, like how much revenue you plan to earn and things like that. In case you are purchasing a new business, in case you are purchasing an already existing business, in that case, we usually don't need to submit a business plan. Just because, in that case, the business has already been operating. So we would be submitting things like the company's tax returns, the company's W-2s, and all of this would show, like how much revenue the company has earned, how much employees the company has had. We would also be submitting things like, existing contracts with clients and similar things. So in this case, you wouldn't, in most cases, you wouldn't need to submit a business plan. Sometimes, in case someone wants to purchase an already existing business and, like let's say that the revenue of that business has been kind of stagnant or has been, decreasing in recent years, or let's say that that company has only had, like 1 or, 2 employees in the past couple of years. In that case, we may suggest, to submit a business plan with that application, just so you are able to explain, like how you plan to increase the revenue? How do you plan to, hire additional employees? So in some cases, even if you are purchasing a business, it may be beneficial to submit a business plan or just kind of like a mini business plan with the application. So what should the business plan contain? So generally, the business plan should be at least 20 to 30 pages. And one really important part of the business plan is going to be an executive summary. The reason why it's really important is because some officers spend like longer time reviewing the E-2 visa application, but other officers, just spend, 5 to 10 minutes kind of reviewing the E-2 visa application before the interview. And if they are, some officers, when they are reviewing the business plan, one thing they kind of like look at is the executive summary. And this should really be kind of like a summary, of the company, of what the company will be doing. So in the executive summary, there should be a section of, like who you are. So this should explain, what the company, like where and when the company was established, what the company will be doing, then there should be section of what do you do. So this section should have information of what services you'll be providing or what products you will be selling. And then who do you sell the products or services to? So this should be basically like a summary of your targeted kind of customers, of who you will be selling to. Another kind of important section of the business plan is market analysis and market research, and then marketing plan. So these sections, should basically explain how you plan to market, should analyze the market, and then should explain how you plan to sell the products or services to customers. So in these sections, you should explain how you plan to market. Some people market through, like website, Instagram, like social media. Other clients focus on different marketing strategies, but this section, like especially for new companies, is really important, because you should be able to explain, how your business will succeed in the US, and how and how you plan to market the products or the services. Another really important part of the business plan is going to be the personal plan. So this should be a chart, and should contain 5 years of hiring projections. And in this chart, you should basically list all the employees you plan to hire in the next 5 years. The chart should contain their job titles, the job description, the kind of like the job duties they'll be performing for the company. It should list their salary. And it should also list like when, in which year you plan to hire these employees. The business plan should also contain comprehensive financial plan. So this should be basically 5 years of financial projections, such as revenue projections, revenue assumptions. So the revenue assumptions are going to be important, and you should definitely submit them in the business plan. Because like, let's say that someone just submits like the revenue chart and say like, I'm going to earn 10 million in year 1, 15 million in year 2, then the officer can definitely ask at the interview, like, how did you come up with these revenue numbers? Are these revenue projections realistic? So the revenue assumptions are going to be basically like explanations, like how did you come up with the with these revenue numbers? And they should definitely be, realistic. So, sometimes it's good to kind of be more conservative. So you are able to explain, at the interview how you are going to achieve, these revenue numbers. The financial projections should also contain cash flow projections and then balance sheet projections. One question we often get is, can I just write the business plan myself, or do I need to hire a professional? So, it's not required that you hire a professional, but, our general recommendation is that unless you have like a background in writing comprehensive business plans, you should definitely hire a professional who can assist you with the business plan, just because, as I mentioned, especially for new businesses, the business plan is extremely important part of your E-2 visa application. So it's going to be really beneficial to hire a professional to assist you with the business plan. Perfect. So now let's talk about some E-2 visa developments and recent adjudication trends. So one thing we have been kind of seeing more and more recently is that, some E-2 cases go into administrative processing. So what is administrative processing? So, at the end of your E-2 visa interview, the officer will, let you know, like what is the outcome of your case. So basically, three things can happen. They can let you know that the case is approved. In that case, you would leave the passport at the consulate. They would issue the E-2 visa stamp, and then you could come to the US on the E-2 visa and start running the business. In some cases, they can let you know that the E-2 visa case is being denied. They would give you a notice informing you that the case was denied. And the third possible outcome is that the case goes into administrative processing. So the consulate, many times they don't let you know like what is the reason, like why the case went into admin processing. Many times, most of the times it's really that they just kind of like need to do some extra security clearance. And so the case is in admin processing until they issue a final decision. In our experience, most of cases that go into admin processing, they get resolved within approximately 60 days. Some cases get resolved much faster than that. After 1 or 2 weeks, the client is informed that the case was approved. But there are some outlier cases as well when the case is in admin processing, for several months. Unfortunately, generally there is not much you can do to kind of speed up the admin processing. You can follow up with the consulate, but unfortunately, if the case is going through some additional, security clearance, the consulate cannot do anything with the case unless they get the final clearance of the applicant. In some cases, the consulate asks for, like, let's say 5 or 10 years of your, like work history, travel history. So if they do ask for additional information, you should submit it to them as soon as possible to kind of speed up the process. But in many cases, they don't ask for additional information, and they just inform you that the case is in admin processing. One question we get about the admin processing is, let's say that your case has been in admin processing for, 2, 3, 4 weeks. The consulate gave you the passport, and, the client asks us, can I travel to the US while the case is in admin processing? Because I need to, like sign some sort of contract or document, or I need to do something in the US. Our advice is generally that you do not travel to the US. You can obviously travel to other countries, but our advice is generally that you do not travel to the US while the case is in admin processing, just because you may have issues entering the US with CBP. One other kind of like recent thing, we have been seeing, and this is especially kind of like since COVID, is that, more and more people prefer to do USCIS filings. And the reason for that, during COVID, it was obvious reason that, many consulates were closed, or, just kind of like the wait times at consulates were really, really long. And people wanted to kind of, like come to the US or stay in the US, and they wanted to start running the business, immediately. So in those cases, USCIS filings, made sense, because with USCIS, you can pay for premium processing. That means that, USCIS will make a decision on your application in 15 business days. And once you have that approval, you can start operating that business immediately. So that's definitely one benefit of filing with USCIS. that, you know, in basically 3 weeks, you can have a decision, and after that, you can start running the business. The disadvantage, as Ian mentioned, is that, you know, the USCIS approval only gives you kind of permission to stay in the US. So if you get approval from USCIS, you can stay in the US for a period of 2 years. But let's say that, you know, you go back to your home country. So once you leave the US, you will have to apply for an E-2 visa at a consulate. So, you know, but many people, we have some clients that, you know, they just kind of want to stay in the US. They don't travel internationally, and we just process, you know, USCIS extensions for them every 2 years. So that's definitely an option. And so, you know, one question we also get is, you know, nowadays still is, you know, what are the timelines at the US consulates abroad? You know, how long does it take to, you know, to get an interview at a consulate? So I would say that most consulates are, you know, back to their kind of processing timelines before COVID, or, you know, like very close to them. There are some consulates that are still, you know, kind of like really backlogged, and it still takes a long time to get an interview. But our, you know, our experience is that most of the consulates throughout the world, they are, you know, back to the processing timelines as they used to have, or kind of like really close. So, you know, it doesn't take that long to get an interview at your consulate. Perfect. So let's talk a little bit more about kind of, skip the slide, about some issues and you know, complex areas that sometimes come up with the, you know, with the E-2 visas. So one thing is source and trail of funds. So, you know, usually if you file at a consulate, the consulates don't focus that much on the source and trail of funds. So of course you will still have to kind of explain, you know, like where the money came from. You will have to show that the money comes from legitimate source, but you know, like you don't have to submit as kind of detailed documentation as you would have to for USCIS filing. So for USCIS filings, and sometimes this is the reason why people prefer, you know, to just kind of submit at a consulate, is that, you know, for USCIS filings, you have to show where the money is coming from, but you also have to show, you know, kind of like very detailed trail of funds. So let's, you know, like let's explain this on an example. So like, let's say that the money, you know, you are starting a company in the US, and the money for the investment comes from your personal savings from employment. So if you were filing at a consulate, you know, you would have to submit your 2 or 3 most recent tax returns, and then, you know, some transfers from your personal account to the E-2 company's account in the US, and then you would have to show how you spend the money. For USCIS filings, you will have to submit, you know, much more documentation than that. So, you know, you will basically have to show that the money, you know, you will have to show, you know, like every time, you know, like each month you were receiving money from your employer, you would have to submit kind of like matching pay stubs or payroll, you know, with the matching amounts you were receiving on your personal account. Then you would have to show that you accumulated this money on your personal account. And then you would have to show the transfers from your personal account onto the E-2 company's business account. So, you know, it's just for USCIS filing, the key point here is that you would just have to kind of submit much more detailed documentation about the source and the trail of funds. You know, sometimes we get a question, you know, like can the money for the E-2 investment, can it come from a loan? So the answer here is yes. You know, anyone, you know, you can get a loan from your friend, from your family. You can get a loan from bank, from you know, from a financial institution. You know, that's completely fine. The loan can be unsecured, it can be secured, but for E-2 visa, the important thing is that the loan should not be secured by the assets of the E-2 company. You know, if let's say that it's secured by, you know, like your house in your home country, or your property in your home country, that's fine for an E-2, but it shouldn't be secured by the assets of the E-2 company. And the money for the E-2 investment, it can also come from a gift. And again, anyone can gift you the money, it can come from your family, friends. But here, one thing to keep in mind is that, let's say that someone, like a family member is gifting you the money. What we would have to submit is a gift letter, that would basically explain, like who is the donor, how much money they are gifting you. But then we would also have to explain where the donor got the money, they're gifting you. So, for this, we would also have to submit some supporting documents. So let's say that the money they are gifting you comes from, like their earnings from employment. In that case, we would have to submit, their like 2 or 3 most recent tax returns, just kind of showing that they did earn the money they are gifting you. So, so Ian talked about this a little bit. So let's talk a little bit more about kind of like the small investment amount. So our general recommendation is that you spend at least $50,000. You invest at least $50,000, and then you can have some additional money on the E-2 company's bank account as working capital. Now, this is kind of like the general advice for consular filings. With USCIS filings, and that's kind of like one reason why someone may decide to do USCIS filing instead of a consulate filing, is that with USCIS filings, we have had success filing cases where the investment amount was kind of much lower than this. So, for USCIS filing, if you spend, like let's say $35,000 and, on kind of wide variety of categories of expenditures, the application, could still be approved with USCIS. So that's just kind of, like one thing to keep in mind when you are deciding where to file, is that with USCIS, the investment amount may be a little bit lower than it would be for consular filings. But again, you would still have to show that you spend money on a wide variety of expenditures, like not just on one kind of category. So let's now talk a little bit more about kind of like a situation where, you and your kind of partner or, a friend, the two of you want to start a company in the US. Is it possible to get an E-2 visa for E-2 investors? So the short answer is yes. So, and a couple comments about that. So it is possible, but basically each of you would have to own 50% in the company, and each of you would have to make the substantial investment, in the E-2 company. So each of you would have to invest, as we mentioned, at least the $50,000 if you are filing at a consulate. And then each of you, the amount both of you are investing should be, the same, or it should be kind of like very similar amount. So it shouldn't be the case that one of you is investing $15,000 and the other one is investing $60,000, because it wouldn't really make sense if, each of you is owning 50% in the company. And then another thing to keep in mind is that each of you would have to have kind of like an executive or a managerial role in the company. So, often when we do kind of cases for E-2 investors, like one of the investors is CEO, the other one is CFO or COO. But the key point is that, each of you would have to have that kind of like executive managerial role in the business. So now let's discuss, some substantive changes that can happen to the E-2 company after, you got your E-2 visa approved. So, there are basically 2 changes that can happen to the business after, you got your E-2 visa. So one is change in ownership. As we said in the beginning, for E2, to qualify for an E2, you have to own at least 50% in the E2 company. And this is a requirement you have to meet at the time you are applying for the E2 visa, but you always have to keep at least 50% in the E2 company, because let's say that, you sell 30-40% to someone else after your E2 visa is approved. In that case, you wouldn't be maintaining your E2 status anymore, because your ownership would drop. So it's really important to keep in mind that you have to meet the ownership requirement at the time you file, but you always have to keep at least that 50% in the E2 company. And then another type of change that sometimes, happens is that, you just kind of want to change, you want to kind of change or add, excuse me, some products you'll be selling or some services you'll be providing. So, let's say that originally you obtained an E2 visa for, like a restaurant. And then, after a year or two, you want to kind of start providing some different services. So it's going to depend, on kind of like what are the additional services going to be. So let's say that you started a restaurant and now you also want to do like a consulting in food industry. You want to consult with other kind of like startup restaurant owners. You want to give them advice. For this type of change, you wouldn't necessarily have to go back to the consulate or to USCIS and ask them, for additional approval for those additional services, just because those additional services and the original type of the E2 business, it's in the same industry, it's very similar, so it generally can be kind of explained as an outgrowth of the original business. But like, let's say that you started a restaurant in the, in the US, and now, you really got, you studied and you really got interested in, I don't know, providing like IT consulting services, just because those two types of businesses are, like really different. In this type of scenario, you would have to go back to the consulate or to USCIS and just kind of, submit an additional business plan and just kind of ask for additional approval, to provide those additional services. Again, just because the two industries are very different, and when the consulate or the USCIS is giving approval, it's the E2 approval for a particular type of business and a particular type of company. So if the new services you'll be providing are completely different, then you will have to get that additional approval from the government. And then, is it possible to buy a business from a family member? So, there is nothing, in the regulations that says that, it's not allowed. But our general recommendation is, we generally kind of advise against it. If possible, just because these types of applications are very scrutinized by the government, because they see that it's from a family member. So they are generally concerned, about, like, are you paying the kind of like a fair market value for the type of business you are purchasing? So, if you really kind of like, if you want to go ahead with the purchase, it's possible. But in that case, we usually kind of like recommend to submit an evaluation of the business, showing, like how the purchase price was calculated, just to show that, like, yes, the purchase is from a family member, but you are paying like a fair market value price for the business. So what are some common reasons for E2 visa denials? So, one of the reasons is that, the investment amount was just too low. So, like, let's say that you spent, $10,000 and then you have $100,000 on the business bank account. Then the government, as Ian mentioned, they generally don't really look at the working capital. They look at the amount of money you spend. So if you only spend $10,000, it's just very hard, like to make the argument that the investment was substantial. So that's a common reason for the denial. Then, sometimes the denial is because it's, it's about the nature of the business, you are kind of starting in the US. So real estate companies are generally very scrutinized by the government because, sometimes people think that, like if they set up an LLC and they buy, couple properties in the US and they start renting out these companies, the properties to people, they want to kind of apply for the E-2 visa, for that LLC. That's just not going to work because that kind of company is passive, it's just basically collecting rent from people, it's really not providing any services, it's going to be hard to kind of explain that you will even have employees. It's definitely possible to get an E-2 visa for a real estate company. Like, let's say that, for example, if the company will be doing, like flips, or will provide management services, to other properties, like, in those types of cases, it would be possible. But just a general comment is that, the government scrutinizes real estate type of businesses kind of much more because they are worried about the, kind of like the passive nature of those businesses. Sometimes the denial happens, just because you file at a certain consulate. So certain consulates, like, for example, the US consulate in Japan, like that consulate, for example, is used to kind of seeing, like large companies, that invested, like where the original investment amount was like $100,000. So if you file kind of like an E-2 visa application, at that consulate and the investment amount is, like, let's say $70,000-$80,000, they may deny the application, just because the officers there are just kind of used to seeing much more, like much higher investment amounts. So sometimes it really, you kind of really have to talk to your immigration attorney to make a strategic decision of, like where to file your application. Sometimes, the reason for the denial is that the US officer just doesn't think that your type of business, your type of company will be able to hire US employees. So, and kind of like what happens here sometimes is, like if you own and operated a similar type of business in your home country, like your whole life, or like, let's say, like for 5 to 10 years, and like you never hired an employee, or you only ever had like one part-time or one full-time employee, then it's just kind of, and the officer asked about this at the interview, they sometimes do, then the officer may just kind of like be concerned, like why, like how are you going to change that with the US company? So, and this may be then the reason for denial. I would say, like, if this is your case, you should be kind of like ready to explain, like how the US company will be different from the company in your home country, how the revenue is going to be higher, how you are going to be able to hire all those employees. But sometimes, unfortunately, if this is the case, they may just deny the case because they may think that, the business is just not going to be able to hire US employees. Another reason for denial may be that you just had some issues with the adjudicating officer. So, like, let's say that in the past you applied for, like a different type of visa at a consulate, and like you have a denial on your record. The officers leave notes in the system. So sometimes there may be just something in your case already kind of flagged, and that they may just deny the E-2 visa application. Again, here, if this is your case, it's going to be beneficial to hire an immigration attorney to kind of discuss the strategy and how to overcome, like any kind of previous denials or issues you had at a particular consulate. And then, another kind of like reason for denial may be that you just kind of like didn't meet the requirements at the time of filing. So, like, let's say that you filed and you prepared and filed the E-2 visa application yourself. And, you just, again, the investment amount was too low, or, like, let's say that you were starting a new business and you like didn't submit a business plan with your application, and you weren't able to kind of describe how you will be able to hire employees in the US, then the officer may just deny because you didn't meet, the E-2 visa requirements. And let's just briefly discuss, some considerations, and things to keep in mind when you are renewing your E-2 visa. So, so what will the consulate or USCIS be looking at in your renewal E-2 visa application? So the most important thing is going to be, they're going to look at whether you hired US employees. So for this, you will be submitting the W-2s, the 3 or 5 more recent years of W-2s. So they're going to see, like how many employees you hired, how much, like whether they were full-time or part-time employees. The salary itself is not really that important for the employees. Obviously it has to meet the minimum wage. But the more important thing is going to be, like how many employees did you hire? You do at the time you are filing the renewal, and you have had since, the E-2 visa was approved. And then another thing you are going to be submitting with the renewal is going to be, the tax returns of the company and the profit and loss and balance sheet for the current calendar year. So with these, you would want to show that the revenue has been kind of increasing every year since you obtained the E-2 visa. Let's say that during COVID, there was a decline. It's not going to be the end of the world. You'll just kind of need to explain in the application, like what happened, why it declined. And then it's going to be important to show that, eventually it started increasing again. Let's say that at the time of your renewal, the company is not doing that well. The company only has, like 1 full-time employee and 1 part-time employee. You can still apply for the renewal. But in this case, we may advise that, you submit kind of like an updated business plan with the renewal application, in which you will explain, the difficulties you have had and kind of like the plans you have going forward, like how the business is going to increase the revenue and hire additional employees going forward. And, and another thing to keep in mind for renewal is, does the company still meet the E-2 visa requirements? So we kind of already discussed this, the ownership changes and changes to the business. And you should explain any of these in the, let's say that the kind of you are now providing additional services, you would explain that in the E-2 visa renewal application. Perfect. So now let's look, we had any questions. So the first question is, if you previously applied for a B2 visa and you were granted a 10-year B1, B2 visa, can you go in on the same visa for B1 purposes to look for an office if setting up a new business or looking for an existing business? E.g. office equipment. So the answer here is yes. You can enter on that valid B1, B2 visa. You would just need to explain to the CBP when you are entering the US, like why are you coming to the US? What is your plan? So you would want to explain that, you are coming to the US to explore E2 visa investment opportunities. And that's, that's a valid reason, to enter on the B1 visa. So that's completely fine. Perfect. So another question is, if I intend to do business in partnership with my friend, can I lend a portion of money from my prospective partner as a loan, or can my partner give me some money in order to qualify for a 50-50 partnership? Ian, do you want to answer?
Sure. I think that we prefer not, I think that particular scenario, while there's no prohibition against it, I think that if it was being done through USCIS, I think that would be fine, because there's nothing that they could point to in the statutes that says that it's not permitted. However, I think that the problem with that is that a consulate might look at it and feel that you aren't really investing anything, because there's another business owner, and the business owner has made their investment, and then they gifted or loaned you the money to make your investment, and they could think that that's not actually what's happening, right? That maybe you're just putting in sweat equity, and that's actually not happening. So we do try and discourage that. I think that if you can get a loan or a gift from another person that isn't part of the business, I think that would be better. So again, no specific prohibition, but I do think it opens you up to more scrutiny when you get to the consulate.
Perfect. So the next question is, being dependent on TD visa, I don't have SSN, social security number. Can we apply for LLC and sign commercial lease before we get an E-2 visa? So yes, you know, many or, you know, most of our clients are kind of, you know, like living outside the US. So, you know, it's in most cases that as well that they don't have a social security number. And so it's fine to set up an LLC and sign a commercial lease. So that's yeah, that's completely fine. The next question is, what are the odds of E-2 acceptance if I want to start a service business from scratch? You know, I would say like majority of our clients, they kind of are starting service-oriented businesses in the US. So that's, you know, that's completely fine. You know, unfortunately, we are not able to provide like a certain specific percentage, you know, like what is your chance of approval, but we have many clients that do that. So the next question is, how old can be expenditure for investment? I invested in some things prior to COVID, and then with ill health, didn't apply for the E-2. It would be helpful to include them. So I would say like it's gonna depend, like, you know, in some cases you will be able to include like older expenditures. But you will, you know, we would have to explain, you know, like how they are kind of related to the E-2 business. You would have to have kind of invoices, proofs of payments for them. But, you know, it may be possible. It may be possible to include these.
And the other thing with that, one other comment with that is that I think that if you're including older expenditures for things that were tangible items, right? Like if they were a computer or furniture, equipment, I think that those ones we can often include. But if you're including older expenditures for things that were intangible, you know, utilities or you know, marketing that was done some time ago, things like that. I think those ones are a lot harder to include because it's harder to say that they relate to the new business. Because with the other ones, with the tangible items, we can just say that they were donated to the business. Whereas it's not really practical to say that for some of the more intangible items.
Perfect. So the next question is, can I apply for an E-2 if I'm already in the US? So, you know, the answer is yes, that's, you know, that's possible. You know, you could file a change of status application. One thing to note here is that, you know, you wouldn't be able to do this if you entered on ESTA, but like, let's say that you are here on a B1 visa or, you know, like F1 visa or any, you know, other visa, you could change, you know, you could file a change of status application and file with USCIS. But again, you know, you would kind of want to discuss a strategy with your immigration attorney to kind of decide, you know, like, is it, you know, whether it makes sense to file with USCIS or if it would make more sense to apply at a consulate. So then we have another question. Can I apply for an E-2 if I have an I-140 pending or approved, and I'm also present in the US? Ian, do you want to take this one?
Sure. So yeah, so you can definitely apply for an E-2 if you have an I-140 pending. You know, I think you have to work very closely with an immigration lawyer to make sure that you are managing the situation, but it's possible to do. You can even apply for an E-2 or renew your E-2 with an I-485 pending. So it's trickier, but it is that even that's possible. So, but it is something you just have to work very closely, because if you know, once you have an I-140 pending, and then if you left the United States, and re-entering that probably isn't going to be a big deal. But if you had to renew the E-2 visa during that period and you had an I-140 pending, you know, and you wanted to get another visa, that might be, you know, that might be more of a problem.
Perfect. So the next question is, if you file at USCIS in the US and get approved, Does the married spouse get working rights, like with the E-2 application at somewhere like London, UK? So the answer is yes. If you file a change of status application with the USCIS, your spouse can apply for a change of status as well. And then once your spouse gets approval from USCIS, then the spouse can start working in the US. What we have been seeing is that if you, let's say that you pay for premium processing with USCIS and you file your and your spouse's application at the same time, it's not an official policy, but if you pay for a premium processing, we have been seeing that USCIS is now approving the investors and the spouses applications at the same time. So, you should have a decision within 15 days, but your spouse should have a decision as well. So that's a really positive thing, because in the past, USCIS processed the investor's application in 15 days, but not the spouses. So then the spouse was kind of waiting for several months. But what we have been seeing recently is that they do process them kind of simultaneously now. Perfect. So we have another question. I'm in the process of opening an LLC for IT services business and have some question. So question one, an IT professional and I have experience in IT for more than 17 years. My spouse is also working in IT. She's in the States on TN visa, and I'm on TD and don't have ITIN or SSN. I'm opening LLC. Is it okay for a spouse to be 20% partner in LLC? Is there any impact on her TN visa? So I would say, like from the E-2 perspective, it's fine if the E-2 investor owns 80% and the spouse owns 20%. So that's completely fine. Just one thing to keep in mind, if the spouse is on the TN visa, is that the spouse, while the spouse is in the US on a TN visa, the spouse cannot work for the new entity, because she can be a passive owner in the E-2 company, but she should only be really working for the US company that sponsored her for the TN. So that's the answer to the first question. The second question is, opening an IT business. The investment will be around $40,000 to $50,000, including different types of fees. Is it good investment and business for E-2 visa? You can, the question, whether it's a good business for E-2 visa. So there is no, you can get an E-2 visa for any sort of business. There is no limitation. We have done many E-2s for, like IT consulting firms. So that's completely fine. Regarding the investment amount, $40,000, $50,000, again, it would kind of depend on, like which consulate you will be applying at. We would kind of need to do a detailed review of, the investment schedule. It may be fine, but you would want to show that you spend the money on kind of a wide variety of expenditures. So again, it would just kind of depend on, we would have to kind of have a closer look at the detailed investment schedule. For IT business, can I show a car purchase as an investment? Generally, we only recommend that a car is included in the E-2 investment. If it's kind of like absolutely necessary, for a business, to provide, services to clients or to sell products. So, for consulting businesses, we generally don't recommend to include a vehicle, just because, we wouldn't be able to kind of explain, like how it's absolutely necessary for you to operate the business, with the car. So we generally kind of like only include the car if the business is, kind of like a food delivery business or kind of like a car transportation business, because otherwise really, like any business could include the car. And we have seen, like some clients come to us after a denial, and then we see that, they invested like $60,000 and 30,000 of it is a car. And like they do mention that kind of like consulates kind of like ask about it and push back on it. So we generally don't recommend to include that. The next question is it okay to purchase all required equipment like laptop, monitors, prints from one supplier like Costco? Does it rate any questions? So no, that's that's completely fine. You can purchase it from the same retailer. That's fine. We have another question. If I was considering setting up a marketing agency which also hosts in-person training events, conferences across the US, would a truck and RV as a mobile office, so can take equipment with and work from different places, count towards expenditure? So again, I would say like the general advice would be, like to kind of like not include the car or truck. Let's say that you have spent, like $60,000, $70,000, $80,000, and then the vehicle was, like additional 10, 15. And, it's kind of like explained in the business plan, like why you will absolutely need the vehicle. We may include it, but the general advice again is, to kind of not include the vehicle because the consulate and USCIS, they kind of like push back on this. The next question is, does having F1 while applying for E-2 through USCIS filing affect the case? No, we have done many change of status applications for people who are in the US on F1, either, like while they are still studying or like during the 60-day grace period. Like one thing you want to be careful about is that, like while you are in the US on F1, like you cannot do any work for the company, at all. Like let's say that the company wants to start taking revenue when you are here on F1, then you will have to have kind of an employee, like who will be taking care of the operations. But the general kind of response is that, it's fine to be on F1 and change status to E-2. Can you add, so the next question is, can you add another business in an unrelated field without having to go through the process again? So unfortunately not. If it's completely like unrelated field, you will have to go back to the consulate or USCIS and ask them for approval for that additional business. The next question is, can I borrow money from my wife for E-2 investment? So yes, that's fine. Your spouse can, gift or loan you the funds. That's fine. The next question is, I will be the primary applicant for E-2 visa. I have been in the US for 3 years. I have my social security number. Hope this make easy for the process. Yes, that's fine. Like if you're in the US, you can file the change of status application. Like a general comment about the social security number is that the social security number will help you to get the EIN kind of faster, because I believe like in that case, you can just kind of apply for it online. So that's like one benefit of having a social security number is that you can apply for the employer identification number, faster online. Otherwise, if you don't have it, you have to, I believe, file it by paper or fax. The next question is, are my children able to attend elementary school while my husband and I are on an E-2 visa? So yes, that's fine. Your children, if they are under the age of 21 and unmarried, they can study in the US, in any school. So that's fine. How much time dependent visa takes if I apply for E-2 from within the US? So I believe, like this would be a scenario where, the investor would be doing like a change of status application in the US, and then the spouse would want to apply for an E-2 visa at a consulate. So the timing would depend, at, like which particular consulate the spouse would want to apply it. Also, like this, this process, like it should be possible. There kind of like used to be kind of direct support in the regulations for this scenario, but then the government, they took it out. But generally, it should be possible if the E2 investor applies for a change of status for a spouse to apply for a visa at a consulate. But just a warning is that, like some consulate, they may want, they may kind of come back to you and ask for, detailed information about the E2 business. And in that case, like you would have to submit some other documentation as well. So it may be kind of good to, like reach out to the particular consulate or consult with an immigration attorney, so you kind of know what to expect. The next question is, when we have only an ESTA, can we fly to the US and also meet with business owners for negotiations? Can we also buy a business during this time? If not, how can we invest? So yes, so it's possible to come on an ESTA as a business visitor. You would just kind of want to, like when the CBP is asking you, like why you are coming to the US, you should just explain, that you are coming to kind of explore E2 visa investment opportunities. But like you don't have to apply for a B1 visa to be able to come to do this. Things like, like meeting with sellers, like negotiating, like those things are generally fine. Like what is not allowed is to kind of, like start operating and kind of like managing the business, from the US. So what are your fees for processing an E2 visa? So feel free to email us and we will be happy to send you our fees. The next question is, can you add another business in an unrelated fee? So I think we already answered this one. The next question we have is, you said that we need to invest money before application, but we have also read that people made buying contracts, which includes a phrase which made the sale only valid after the E2 visa approval. Yeah, so I think you are referring to like a purchase of a business when the kind of the purchase goes through an escrow agent. So I'll just kind of quickly explain this. So like when you are deciding, like when you are purchasing a business from a seller in the US, you can either just transfer the purchase price directly to the seller. If that's the case, like if for any reason the E2 visa is denied, like you would still, the transaction would still be valid, and you would still, have to kind of like, like you would still be owning that business. There is a possibility to kind of like structure this and sign an escrow agreement with an escrow agent. So in this case, the escrow agreement would basically explain that, like if for any reason the E2 visa is denied, the money would go back to you as the buyer. If the E2 visa is approved, the money would go back, would go to the seller. So, there are a couple things to kind of like keep in mind about the escrow. All the other contingencies to the sale would have to be satisfied. The only contingency left would be the approval of the E2 visa. But this is, we often see, like some people, we have clients that kind of like, like want to buy a company in the US regardless of whether the E2 visa is going to be approved or denied, because they just want to kind of like own the company. Some people are more, they kind of want the E2 visa approval. So in this case, it may be really beneficial to kind of structure it and do it through the escrow. So in this case, if the E2 visa is denied for any reason, you would get, the money back. The next question is there a waiting time from arriving on B1 visa before filing at USCIS with premium processing for a change of status? I think I read 45 days you have to wait, but not sure. Yeah, so there is not really, you have to file the change of status application before your I-94 expires. So you would want to check when your I-94 expires. I would say like generally it takes some time, after you come to the US, to set up a bank account, purchase all the equipment and things. So to be able to file the change of status, but there is not really, the only rule here is that you have to file before your I-94 expires.
The only other quick comment with that is that when you, like, let's say you came to the United States and you were here, and then you decided that you you changed your mind and you decided that you wanted to change status, that would be fine. But you can't enter the United States with the intent to change status. So it's and that's where sometimes the change, like let's say you entered and then the next day you file the change of status application, the government might question like what your actual intent was when you entered. So sometimes, people, their minds change after, a certain period of time. I think the 45 days you're referring to, it's just something old in the instructions. I don't know why they haven't changed that, but in the past, when it actually used to take them 45 days to adjudicate these things, they used to say, file them at least 45 days before your status expires, because they actually would adjudicate them in 45 days. Whereas now that's never happened. So that's yeah, not really applicable.
Perfect. So the next question is is the spouse landlocked on a change of status to E2? I'm not like the spouse, so like let's say that the spouse gets an E2 approval. The spouse can then change to another status, like that's completely fine. So like let's say, for example, that someone like sponsors the E2 spouse for like an H1B, in H1B lottery, the spouse gets selected, the spouse can then change into another status. So that's, that's fine. If I apply for an E2 from within the US and my partner is in a treaty country, will the E2 visa be processed at the same time? Yeah, so I think we already discussed this, you are basically filing like two different applications, like one is with the USCIS, the other is at a consulate. So again, like you would just kind of want to double check, like what documents, the consulate will need to process that application. So we have another question, and I think it asks about our fees. So again, feel free to email us, and we'll be happy to send you the fees. So then we have a next question. I think someone was having trouble if we see the questions, but I think we answered these already.
I think I saw that question got answered, but if not, you can just send us some emails.
The next question is, if E2 visa is approved for primary applicant, how about wife and daughter? So if you're applying for an E2 visa, your spouse and your children under the age of 21 and unmarried can apply with you, at the same time for E2 visas, and they can come to the US. Your spouse can work in the US or study, and your children can study in the US as well. And then we have a last question. If you were approved for an E2 with purchasing a franchise, can you buy and rent properties as well after some time, as long as you continue to run the franchise you were originally approved for? So I would say like, like this, it's kind of, it will depend, so like, let's say that, like you just kind of buy the properties, under your own name and just kind of like passively rent them, like you wouldn't necessarily kind of need an E2 approval for that. But it would just kind of depend on that particular situation. And then we have a last question. I heard on E2 visa, kids can stay until 21. Can they extend the stay or go back home? So so they'll only be able to stay until until they're 21, and after that they can switch to different status. So they can, many children in this situation, they just kind of apply for an F1 visa if they want to continue studying in the US. And then we have one last question. Only one question with opening an LLC was not answered. So maybe if you just kind of want to type it quickly, we can
Perfect.
quickly.
Yeah, and what I'll do is, while you're typing that question, there's just someone had sent in 3 questions before the webinar, so I'll just run through them quickly because we only have a couple of minutes left. One is, are there any visas that allow you to eventually get a green card? So the answer to that is no. The US system, just that doesn't exist, where you get a visa and then that turns into a green card eventually. What happens instead is there are just a list of green card categories, and if you're eligible for them, you can apply. And we do have a webinar on moving from visas to green cards, so you can definitely check that out. It's on our YouTube channel. Does real estate investing count as a business? i.e. owning multiple properties and starting a management company to run the property. So I think Michaela covered that as well, that it just depends on whether it's passive or whether it's active. If it's a business where we have done real estate investing, where the person has had 50 properties and it rises to the level of business, that's an E2 case. And we've had people who've tried to apply for an E2, not with us, but apply on their own, maybe where they have one property or two property, and those are not good E2 cases. And then the last one is the fee. So just send us an email about that. And then the question of, I think they just a general question, but is an E2 visa guaranteed? And nothing, and that's like E2 visa is just like everything else in life, not guaranteed. So so definitely, send us in terms of did that person write out that last question again?
Yeah. So it is before buying a business in the US, would it be beneficial to open an LLC and also the company through the LLC before the E2 application? So so definitely, for an E2 visa, you will need to set up a company in the US. You cannot apply for an E2 visa as an individual. You have to set up a company in the US, like corporation, LLC, any type of company, and then you have to own at least 50% or more in the company, and then you will be basically applying for an E2 visa under that company. So that company will be annotated on your visa. If you if you are buying a business in the US, you would want to buy it under that company. So definitely, yes, you will need to set up a company in the US before applying.
Okay. Excellent. And we do have to end here because I have to run, and we do have to end the call now, so we're right at the 31-minute mark. So great questions, a lot of questions, fantastic, and definitely a lot of interest. Definitely, if you want more answers to questions, you can definitely set up a consultation, and we will send, as I said, a copy of this webinar, a copy of the PowerPoint presentation, and also a copy of our guide. We have an E2 visa guide that has a lot more information on E2s. And as I said, check out our YouTube channel for more webinars.
Thank
Perfect.
you.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Okay. Thanks, Michaela. Great. Thank you.